matches. This piece is derivative and, frankly, amateurish.
The champagne flute trembled in Victoria Ashworth's manicured fingers as she watched the auction hammer fall. $5 million. The number echoed through Sotheby's auction house like a death knell, each syllable driving deeper into her chest. On the massive screen behind the auctioneer, Zara Williams's painting, Resilience in Blue, glowed under the spotlights. The same canvas Victoria had dismissed as street art masquerading as fine art just 18 months ago. The irony tasted bitter as champagne on Victoria's tongue. She could still hear her own voice, sharp and dismissive, cutting through her pristine Manhattan gallery. "We don't showcase that type of work here. Perhaps you'd find a more suitable venue in Brooklyn." The memory of Zara's face, the way hope crumbled into quiet dignity, now haunted every corner of Victoria's crumbling empire. But this story isn't just about a painting worth more than most people's homes. It's about the moment when prejudice met genius, when power collided with purpose, and when one woman's refusal to see beyond skin color cost her everything while elevating another to heights she never imagined possible. What happens when the art world's deepest prejudices are exposed by the very brilliance they sought to suppress? When talent refuses to be silenced by discrimination? Subscribe now, because this story will change how you see every gallery, every artist, and every moment when someone tells you that you don't belong. The truth about Zara Williams and Victoria Ashworth will leave you questioning everything. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ashworth Contemporary like liquid gold, casting geometric shadows across the pristine marble floors. Victoria Ashworth moved through her domain with the practiced grace of someone who had spent 15 years curating not just art, but power itself. Her heels clicked against the stone with metronomic precision, each step echoing through the gallery's cathedral-like silence. Everything here whispered money. The walls, painted in that specific shade of white that cost $300 per gallon, served as neutral backdrops for canvases worth more than most people's homes. A Rothko commanded the eastern wall, its burgundy depths seeming to pulse with their own heartbeat. Across the room, a Jackson Pollock danced in calculated chaos, each splatter worth thousands, each drip a testament to Victoria's discerning eye. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashworth." Sarah, her assistant, appeared from behind the reception desk like a ghost materialized from expensive air. 24 years old, art history degree from Yale, unpaid internship that her trust fund father could afford. Victoria had hired her not for her qualifications, but for what she represented, the kind of pedigree that opened doors without knocking. Victoria nodded without breaking stride. She had a ritual each morning, a meditation of sorts, where she walked the perimeter of her gallery and confirmed that everything remained exactly as it should be. The lighting precisely calibrated to bring out the emotional depth in each piece. The temperature maintained at exactly 72 degrees to preserve both art and atmosphere. The subtle scent of bergamot diffusing through hidden vents, creating an olfactory signature that clients associated with sophistication. This was her kingdom, built one strategic acquisition at a time. Each painting on these walls had been chosen not just for its artistic merit, but for its ability to elevate her reputation, to cement her position in the rarefied air of Manhattan's art elite. She had turned rejection into an art form, saying no to countless hopefuls who didn't understand that talent alone was never enough. It was about pedigree, about the story you could tell at cocktail parties, about whether your artist had the right connections, the right background, the right look for the gallery walls. The morning appointment book lay open on Sarah's desk, a leather-bound testament to Victoria's influence. Lunch with the Hamptons collector, who was considering commissioning a new piece. 2 o'clock, with the art critic from Art Forum, whose review could make or break a new exhibition. 4:30 with the interior designer who decorated penthouses for Wall Street wives. Each name carefully cultivated, each relationship another thread in the web of influence that kept Ashworth contemporary at the apex of the city's cultural hierarchy. Victoria paused before the Basquiat that anchored her private office, its raw energy contained within a frame that cost more than most cars. She had acquired it 5 years ago, back when his work was still considered edgy, before the market recognized his genius. The irony wasn't lost on her. A black artist whose work now sold for tens of millions, whose paintings she displayed with pride. But Basquiat was different. He was dead, sanitized by time and market forces, his rebellion transformed into investment potential. The living artists were more complicated. They came with messy stories, unpredictable personalities, demands for authenticity that didn't always align with market demands. Victoria had learned to navigate these waters carefully, supporting emerging talent when it served her interests, maintaining relationships that looked progressive on the surface, while ensuring her client base remained comfortable. The intercom buzzed softly. "Mrs. Ashworth? Your 10:30 appointment is here. A Miss Zara Williams?" Victoria frowned, scanning her mental calendar. She didn't recognize the name, which was unusual. Sarah typically screened walk-ins, redirecting the hopeless cases to smaller venues more suited to their circumstances. "I don't recall scheduling—" "She doesn't have an appointment." Sarah's voice carried that particular tone reserved for people who didn't understand how the art world actually worked. "But she's been waiting since we opened. She says she has something special to show you." The presumption was breathtaking. Artists didn't simply appear at Ashworth Contemporary with portfolios tucked under their arms, hoping for audience with the queen of Manhattan's art scene. There were protocols, proper channels, a hierarchy that kept order in a world that could easily descend into chaos if everyone with a paintbrush thought they deserved consideration. But something in Sarah's tone suggested this wasn't the usual delusional dreamer. Victoria checked her reflection in the Basquiat's glass, ensuring her appearance projected the appropriate blend of accessibility and authority. Her silver hair was pulled back in a chignon that cost more to maintain than most people's monthly rent. Her black Armani suit fit like liquid shadow, professional yet intimidating. "Send her in," Victoria decided. Sometimes these impromptu meetings provided entertainment, cautionary tales she could share at dinner parties about the audacity of the uninitiated. Plus, she had 20 minutes before her next appointment, enough time to deliver a gentle but firm education about how the art world actually functioned. The gallery's front door chimed as Sarah escorted the visitor back. Victoria positioned herself behind her desk, using the massive piece of furniture as both shield and symbol of authority. The morning light streaming through the windows would backlight her perfectly, creating an almost divine glow while leaving her visitor squinting against the brilliance. But when Zara Williams stepped into the office, Victoria felt something shift in the air, like the atmospheric pressure change that precedes a storm. The young woman moved with quiet confidence, her dark skin luminous against a simple white blouse that somehow managed to look both elegant and artistic. Her natural hair was styled in a crown of tight curls that caught the light like a halo, and she carried a leather portfolio with the careful reverence of someone transporting something precious. Most importantly, she didn't seem intimidated by the grandeur surrounding her. Her eyes moved across the walls with the practiced gaze of someone who understood composition, who could read the language of color and form that separated true artists from mere decorators. When her gaze settled on the Basquiat, Victoria saw recognition flicker across her features, not star-struck awe, but the respectful acknowledgement of one artist appreciating another's work. This was not going to be as simple as Victoria had anticipated. Zara's hands remained steady as she untied the portfolio strings, her fingers moving with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. Victoria watched from behind her fortress of mahogany and marble, noting the way the young woman seemed to claim space without demanding it, how her presence filled the room despite her deliberate restraint. "I appreciate you taking the time to see me, Mrs. Ashworth." Zara's voice carried the warm cadences of someone raised in the South, but educated in the North, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. "I know unscheduled visits aren't typical, but I believe you'll understand once you see what I've brought." Victoria's fingers drummed against her desk's surface, a subtle reminder of her impatience. She had mastered the art of the power dynamic, using silence and position to establish dominance from the first moment of any interaction. But Zara seemed immune to these tactics, continuing her preparations with unhurried focus that spoke of genuine confidence rather than nervous bravado. "I should mention," Victoria said, her tone carrying the weight of 15 years of rejections delivered with surgical precision, "that we have very specific criteria for the artists we represent. Our clientele expects a certain caliber of work that aligns with established market values and cultural significance." The words were carefully chosen, a verbal dance that communicated exclusion without legal liability. Victoria had perfected this language over years of practice, learning to say no in ways that sounded almost complimentary while leaving no room for misunderstanding. Zara's eyes met Victoria's directly, holding the gaze longer than most artists dared. "I understand completely. That's exactly why I'm here." With deliberate movements, Zara lifted the portfolio's cover and revealed what lay beneath. The breath caught in Victoria's throat before she could stop it. Even inverted, even catching only fragments of color and composition from across the desk, she could see that this was something different, something that made her trained eye involuntarily focus and assess before her conscious mind could engage its defensive filters. "May I?" Zara asked, gesturing toward the wall space beside Victoria's desk. Against her better judgment, Victoria nodded. She told herself it was curiosity, professional due diligence, but as Zara carefully lifted the canvas and turned it to face the room, Victoria felt something inside her chest tighten like a fist. Resilience in blue seemed to breathe with life. The painting measured 3 feet by 4 feet, large enough to command attention without overwhelming the space, but its impact felt much larger than its physical dimensions. Cerulean blue formed the foundation, but not the flat, uniform blue of an amateur. These were dozens of shades, layers upon layers of pigment, that created depth and movement that seemed to shift with the viewer's perspective. Gold highlights danced across the surface like captured sunlight, but not the gaudy gold of decoration. This was the gold of wheat fields, of skin touched by dawn, of hope that refused to be extinguished. The brush strokes varied from whisper-thin details that required close examination to bold sweeps that could be felt from across the room. Some areas were smooth as glass, others built up in thick impasto that cast shadows and caught light like miniature mountain ranges. But it was the emotional resonance that stopped Victoria's breath entirely. The painting told a story without depicting a single recognizable object. It spoke of struggle and triumph, of bending without breaking, of beauty that emerged from hardship rather than despite it. Every technique displayed mastery, color theory, composition, the interplay of texture and light, but the techniques served something larger, something that transcended mere technical skill. Victoria's eye, trained through decades of evaluation, automatically catalogued the painting's merits. The composition followed classical principles while pushing boundaries in subtle ways. The color palette was sophisticated enough for the most discerning collectors. The execution showed the kind of technical mastery that took years to develop. This wasn't outsider art or naive expression. This was museum-quality work created by someone who understood not just how to paint, but how to make painting transcendent. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the subtle hum of the gallery's climate control system and the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic. Victoria felt trapped between recognition and resistance, between her professional assessment and her personal prejudices. The painting demanded acknowledgement, but acknowledgement would require her to confront assumptions she had never examined. The technique is competent, Victoria finally managed, her voice carefully modulated to suggest professional assessment rather than personal reaction. But I'm afraid this style doesn't align with our gallery's aesthetic direction. We tend to focus on work that fits within established contemporary movements, pieces that our collectors can contextualize within art historical frameworks. Zara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted like light changing direction. I see. And what framework would you use to contextualize the Basquiat behind you, or the Pollock in your main gallery? The question landed like a challenge, polite but pointed. Victoria felt heat rise in her chest, the kind of flush that came from being outmaneuvered in her own domain. Those artists have established provenance, market history, critical recognition. Basquiat died at 27, with critics calling his work primitive and unrefined. Zara interrupted gently. Pollock was dismissed as a fraud for years before the art world recognized his innovation. Every artist in your gallery was once unknown, once unproven, once dismissed by someone who couldn't see past their own limitations. The words hit Victoria like physical blows, each one precisely targeted. But rather than acknowledge the accuracy of Zara's observation, Victoria felt her defenses crystallize into something harder, colder. This young woman was overstepping, using Victoria's own artists as weapons against her judgment. The audacity was breathtaking. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, rising from her chair to signal the end of the meeting. "But we don't showcase that type of work here. Perhaps you'd find a more suitable venue in Brooklyn. There are galleries there that specialize in urban contemporary pieces." The phrase, "that type of work," hung in the air between them like a blade, sharp enough to cut, but vague enough to deny intent. Victoria had chosen her words with the precision of a surgeon, inflicting maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Zara carefully returned the painting to its protective covering, her movements controlled despite what Victoria assumed must be crushing disappointment. But when she looked up, there was no collapse, no dramatic exit. Instead, there was something in her eyes that Victoria couldn't quite identify. Not anger, not hurt, but a kind of quiet certainty that was somehow more unsettling than any emotional outburst would have been. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Ashworth," Zara said, her voice steady as stone. "I hope you remember this painting. I have a feeling you'll be seeing it again." As the gallery door closed behind Zara Williams, Victoria felt a strange hollowness in her chest, as if something important had been extracted from the room. She looked at the space where resilience in blue had briefly transformed her office, now empty except for the lingering sense that she had just made a mistake, whose consequences she couldn't yet fathom. But Victoria Ashworth was a master of her domain, and masters didn't second-guess their decisions. She smoothed her suit, checked her reflection, and prepared for her next appointment. After all, she had a reputation to maintain, a kingdom to protect, and standards that couldn't be compromised simply because someone had talent. She had no way of knowing that in 18 months, she would watch that same painting sell for $5 million, while her own gallery crumbled around her. Some mistakes take time to reveal their true cost. The subway rumbled beneath Zara's feet as she descended into the arteries of Brooklyn. Resilience in blue, secured in its protective case against her side. The rejection still stung, not because she hadn't expected it, but because she had allowed herself a moment of hope when she saw Victoria's eyes widen at the painting's reveal. For just an instant, she had witnessed pure artistic recognition before prejudice slammed down like a steel door. But disappointment was a luxury Zara couldn't afford. She had learned long ago that closed doors were simply invitations to find windows, that rejection from one world often meant acceptance into a better one. The train car around her hummed with the energy of people heading home from real jobs, their hands stained with honest work, their conversations peppered with languages that told stories of dreams carried across oceans. This was where art lived and breathed, not in sterile galleries where champagne cost more than most people's groceries, but in the spaces where creativity emerged from necessity, where beauty bloomed despite circumstances rather than because of them. Zara had spent 4 years building relationships in Brooklyn's underground art scene, earning respect through her work and her willingness to support other artists who had been deemed not quite right for Manhattan's exclusive circles. The warehouse that housed Marcus Chen's gallery, Authentic Voices, stood like a beacon of possibility in the industrial landscape of Red Hook. The building's brick exterior bore the scars of decades weathering storms, both meteorological and economic, but inside, it pulsed with the kind of energy that Victoria's pristine space could never contain. The scent of turpentine mixed with coffee, paint fumes danced with incense, and the sound of passionate conversation created a symphony that spoke of art as a living, breathing necessity rather than a commodity. Marcus looked up from where he was adjusting lights around a sculpture made from reclaimed metal and discarded electronics, his face breaking into a grin when he saw Zara approaching. At 35, he had spent a decade transforming this space from an abandoned storage facility into Brooklyn's most innovative gallery, creating a platform for artists whose work challenged conventions rather than confirming them. "Let me guess," he said, reading the expression on her face with the intuition of someone who had navigated similar rejections. "The Ice Queen wasn't ready for your fire?" Zara set her portfolio down with deliberate care, the same reverence she had shown in Victoria's office. She called it that type of work, and suggested I try somewhere more suitable in Brooklyn. Marcus's expression darkened with the particular anger reserved for coded language that everyone understood, but no one could prosecute. That type of work, right. And by suitable, she meant somewhere that would know my place, Zara finished, unwrapping Resilience in Blue, with hands that trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the controlled fury that came from being diminished by someone who should have recognized greatness. The painting seemed to expand in the warehouse space, its blues and golds catching the industrial lighting in ways that made it appear almost luminescent. Other artists working in the space began to drift closer, drawn by the magnetic pull that great art exerts on those who understand its language. Maya, the sculptor whose work explored themes of displacement and identity, gasped audibly. Roberto, whose murals had transformed abandoned buildings across the borough, shook his head in amazement. This is what she rejected? Maya's voice carried disbelief, mixed with the kind of rage that comes from watching talent dismissed for all the wrong reasons. This belongs in museums, not hidden away because some gallery owner can't see past her own prejudices. The gathering crowd represented the full spectrum of Brooklyn's artistic community. Painters and sculptors, photographers and installation artists, representing every ethnicity and background imaginable. They understood struggle in ways that Victoria's privileged clients never could, and they recognized excellence wherever it emerged. Their faces reflected the same awe that Victoria had tried so hard to suppress, but here, in this space, that awe could be expressed without filter or fear. Marcus studied the painting with the trained eye of someone who had discovered countless overlooked talents. His gallery had launched careers that Manhattan's establishment had ignored, championed voices that needed amplifying, created space for art that challenged rather than simply decorated. "This doesn't just belong on our walls," he said finally. "This needs to be seen by everyone. This needs to start conversations that people in glass towers are too comfortable to have." The Next 3 hours transformed Resilience in Blue from a rejected submission into the centerpiece of an impromptu movement. Marcus cleared the main wall, relocating other pieces to create the perfect viewing environment. Maya adjusted the lighting to bring out every nuance of color and texture. Roberto documented the installation process, his camera capturing the moment when art found its proper home. But the real magic happened when they opened the doors. Word had spread through the networks that connected Brooklyn's artistic community. Text messages, social media posts, whispered conversations in coffee shops and studios. By 7 o'clock, the gallery pulsed with energy as people flowed in to witness something they had heard was extraordinary. The diversity of the crowd would have terrified Victoria's usual clientele. Young professionals, still in their work clothes, rubbed shoulders with artists whose paint-stained jeans told stories of creative labor. College students debated technique with senior citizens who had witnessed decades of artistic evolution. Children pressed their faces close to examine brushstrokes, while their parents discussed the emotional resonance that radiated from the canvas. Zara found herself surrounded by conversations she had never experienced in formal gallery settings. People didn't whisper reverently or maintain careful distance. They engaged passionately, asking questions about process and inspiration, sharing their own emotional responses without self-consciousness. An elderly woman with calloused hands spoke of her grandmother's quilts, drawing connections between different forms of artistic expression. A young man fresh from art school analyzed the technical mastery while acknowledging the emotional impact that transcended mere skill. "This is what art should do," said Dr. Amelia Foster, a professor from Pratt Institute, who had driven over specifically to see the painting after hearing about it through her network of former students. "It should make us feel, make us think, make us question our assumptions." This piece does all of that while demonstrating masterful technique. Whoever rejected this doesn't understand what art is actually for. The comment sparked a larger conversation about gatekeeping in the art world, about who gets to decide what deserves recognition and what criteria are actually being used to make those decisions. People shared stories of their own rejections, their own encounters with establishments that valued pedigree over passion. But rather than becoming a session of complaints, the gathering evolved into something more powerful, a celebration of resilience, a recognition that great art finds its audience regardless of official sanction. As the evening progressed, something unprecedented began happening. People started taking photographs, not the casual snapshots that tourists might grab, but carefully composed images that captured the painting's essence. These photos began appearing on social media with hashtags that would soon trend beyond Brooklyn's artistic community. Resilience in Blue, Art Beyond Prejudice. Real recognizes real. Each post came with personal stories, individual reactions, connections made between the painting's themes and viewers' own experiences. The energy was organic, authentic in ways that no marketing campaign could manufacture. People were sharing not because they had been asked to, but because they had been moved to, because they had witnessed something that demanded wider recognition. By midnight, as Marcus began the process of closing the gallery, Resilience in Blue had been seen by over 200 people and shared across social media platforms thousands of times. The painting that Victoria Ashworth had dismissed as that type of work had become the focal point of conversations happening across the city, country, and increasingly, the world. Zara stood before her painting one last time before leaving, seeing it now not as the work that had been rejected, but as the catalyst for something she was only beginning to understand. The blues seemed deeper, the golds more radiant, as if the painting itself had absorbed the energy of everyone who had truly seen it. The revolution had begun, and it was painted in shades of resilience that no amount of prejudice could dim. Victoria's morning ritual felt different 3 weeks after Zara's visit, though she couldn't immediately identify why. The gallery remained pristine, the lighting perfectly calibrated, the temperature maintained at exactly 72 degrees. Her reflection in the Basquiat's glass showed the same composed expression, the same expensive suit, the same silver hair styled to project authority. But something in the air had shifted, like the barely perceptible change in atmospheric pressure that precedes a storm. The first sign came disguised as casual conversation. Charles Whitmore, a collector whose penthouse housed $17 million worth of carefully curated art, mentioned during their lunch meeting that he had seen some interesting work coming out of Brooklyn. The comment seemed innocuous enough, the kind of patronizing acknowledgement that Manhattan's elite occasionally offered to the outer borough's artistic efforts. But there was something in Charles's tone that suggested more than casual awareness. "There's a painter getting significant attention," he continued, swirling his wine with the practiced motion of someone who had attended 1,000 such lunches. "Social media is calling her work transformative. Even some serious critics are taking notice." Victoria maintained her expression of polite interest, while feeling something cold settle in her stomach. The art world, for all its pretensions to sophistication, operated on gossip and whispered recommendations. Information flowed through networks of influence like electricity through copper wire, carrying news, opinions, and, most importantly, market signals that determined who rose and who fell. "Brooklyn has always had its enthusiastic supporters," Victoria replied, choosing her words with the careful precision that had served her well for 15 years. "Though I find that social media attention rarely translates to serious collecting interest." Charles nodded, but his eyes held a spark of something that hadn't been there before their conversation began. "Perhaps, though I hear Sotheby's has been making inquiries. Apparently, there's significant collector interest from some unexpected quarters." The name Sotheby's hit Victoria like a physical blow, though her expression never wavered. The auction house represented the pinnacle of art world legitimacy, the final arbiter of what deserved recognition and what commanded serious money. If they were making inquiries about work emerging from Brooklyn's underground scene, it meant someone with real influence had taken notice. The rest of lunch passed in a blur of practiced conversation about market trends and upcoming exhibitions. But Victoria's mind raced through possibilities and implications. She had dismissed dozens of artists over the years, sent countless hopefuls to Brooklyn galleries with the kind of patronizing suggestions she had offered Zara. Most disappeared into obscurity, their rejections becoming footnotes in careers that never achieved significance. But occasionally, very occasionally, she made mistakes. The afternoon brought more unsettling signals. Dr. Patricia Hernandez from the Museum of Modern Art called to cancel their dinner meeting, citing unexpected scheduling conflicts. The conversation was brief, professional, and completely unlike Patricia's usual warmth. They had known each other for 8 years, collaborated on 3 exhibitions, maintained the kind of relationship that sustained careers in the art world. But Patricia's voice carried something new. Not hostility, exactly, but a careful distance that spoke of reputation management. People in their position didn't maintain friendships that might compromise their professional standing. And if Patricia was pulling back, it meant she had heard something that made association with Victoria potentially problematic. The third signal came through Sarah, who mentioned almost casually that the art critic from Art Forum had rescheduled their interview. "She said something came up," Sarah reported, her young face showing the kind of confusion that came from witnessing patterns she didn't yet understand. "She seemed different, more formal than usual." Victoria nodded as if such changes were perfectly normal, but internally, she felt the architecture of her carefully constructed world beginning to shift. Critics, collectors, museum directors, they formed an ecosystem of influence that sustained galleries like hers. When that ecosystem began to change its behavior patterns, even subtly, It meant something fundamental was shifting in the larger environment. That evening, alone in her gallery after Sarah had gone home, Victoria did something she hadn't done in years. She opened her laptop and searched social media for mentions of her gallery. The results were initially reassuring. Positive reviews, images of her exhibitions, the kind of steady buzz that indicated ongoing relevance in cultural conversations. But then she searched for Brooklyn art and emerging artists, and the digital world revealed a landscape she hadn't imagined. Thousands of posts featured a painting she recognized with sickening clarity. Resilience in Blue, commanding attention in what appeared to be a warehouse gallery, surrounded by crowds of people whose faces showed the kind of genuine emotional engagement that her own openings rarely achieved. The hashtags told a story that made her hands tremble as she scrolled. Real art, real voices. Beyond the gallery walls, "Ye heart out for art without gatekeepers." But it was the comments that truly frightened her. Not angry rants or emotional outbursts, but thoughtful discussions about the art world's exclusionary practices, personal stories about rejection and bias, critical analyses that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both artistic technique and cultural dynamics. One comment thread particularly caught her attention. It began with an image of resilience in blue, accompanied by text that read, "When you create something that moves people, but get told it doesn't belong in serious galleries." This painting was rejected by Manhattan's so-called experts. Their loss is our gain. The thread had been shared 8,000 times, with responses from artists, critics, collectors, and art lovers around the world. The responses ranged from personal stories of similar rejections to professional analyses of gatekeeping in the cultural sector. But most disturbing were the comments from people Victoria recognized, names from her own professional network, collectors who had purchased pieces from her gallery, critics who had praised her exhibitions. They weren't attacking her directly, but their enthusiasm for work she had rejected felt like a judgment on her professional capabilities. Dr. Foster from Pratt Institute had written, "This is exactly the kind of work that demonstrates why we need to expand our definition of what belongs in prestigious spaces. The technical mastery is undeniable, but more importantly, it creates the kind of emotional resonance that art should aspire to. Any gallery that would reject this has lost sight of what art is actually for." A prominent collector from Los Angeles had commented, "I've been following this artist's work since seeing this piece online. There's a waiting list now for her paintings, and I understand why. This is museum-quality work, with the kind of authentic voice that's becoming increasingly rare in overly commercialized art spaces." Even more ominous was a comment from James Morrison, the art critic whose reviews could make or break careers. Sometimes the most interesting art emerges from spaces that haven't been sanitized by commercial considerations. This painter represents exactly the kind of fresh perspective that established galleries seem incapable of recognizing. Victoria closed the laptop with hands that shook despite her attempts at control. The digital conversations she had discovered weren't just appreciation for good art, they were implicit criticism of the systems and institutions that had failed to recognize that art's value. Her gallery, her judgment, her carefully cultivated reputation were being questioned by the very people whose opinions determined success in the art world. The phone rang, cutting through her spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was familiar. Thomas Chen, Marcus's older brother, who worked as an advisor to several major collectors on the West Coast. "Victoria, I hope you don't mind me calling so late," Thomas said, his tone carrying the kind of studied casualness that meant he was delivering important information. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something that's generating significant buzz out here. There's a painter, Zara Williams, whose work is creating quite a stir among collectors who focus on emerging talent." Victoria felt the room tilt around her as Thomas continued. I know you see a lot of work, so you might not remember her specifically, but apparently she approached several Manhattan galleries recently. The story is that she was turned away, told her work wasn't suitable for serious consideration. That narrative is adding to the interest. People love a story about overlooked talent being discovered. The carefully constructed world Victoria had spent 15 years building felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards trembling in a wind she hadn't noticed gathering strength. The phone call continued, but she barely heard Thomas's words over the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. She had made a mistake. Not just any mistake, but the kind of catastrophic error in judgment that ended careers. And now, as social media amplified the story and serious players in the art world took notice, that mistake was about to extract a price she was only beginning to comprehend. 18 months after that fateful morning when Zara Williams walked into Ashworth Contemporary, the hallowed halls of Sotheby's buzzed with the kind of electric anticipation that preceded art history. The auction house had witnessed legendary moments. Van Gogh's The Starry Night, commanding record prices, Picasso's revolutionary works reshaping market expectations. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the establishment was about to confront the consequences of its own blindness. The catalog listing for Lot 47 read simply, Zara Williams, American, B. 1989, Resilience in Blue, 2023, Oil on Canvas, 36 x 48 inches. Estimate, $800,000, $200,000. But those dry facts failed to capture the cultural earthquake that had brought this painting to auction. The pre-sale exhibition had drawn crowds that spilled onto York Avenue, with viewers waiting hours to stand before the canvas that had started a revolution. Zara sat in the third row, her presence radiating the quiet confidence that had emerged from 18 months of vindication. The simple black dress she wore cost less than Victoria's weekly champagne budget, but she commanded attention in ways that no amount of money could purchase. Beside her sat Marcus Chen, whose warehouse gallery had become a pilgrimage site for collectors seeking authentic voices. Maya and Roberto flanked them, representing the Brooklyn art community that had nurtured Zara when Manhattan's elite turned her away. The transformation in Zara's life had been meteoric yet earned. After that first night at Authentic Voices, collectors had begun making pilgrimages to Brooklyn, drawn by social media buzz that had evolved into serious critical recognition. Art magazines that had never ventured beyond Manhattan's gallery district published features about the Brooklyn Renaissance with Zara as its reluctant poster child. Museums that typically waited decades before acknowledging emerging artists began acquiring her work for their permanent collections. But success hadn't changed her essential nature. She still painted in the converted warehouse space that Marcus had helped her secure, still mixed her own pigments according to techniques learned from her grandmother, still approached each canvas with the reverence of someone who understood that art was responsibility as much as expression. The difference was that now the world was finally listening. Victoria watched the proceedings from the back of the auction room, her presence as spectral as her former influence. The intervening months had stripped away the armor of reputation and financial security that had once made her untouchable. Ashworth Contemporary had closed 6 months ago, its pristine walls now bare, its client list scattered to competitors who hadn't made her particular mistake. The cascade of consequences had been swift and merciless. Within 3 months of Zara's rejection going viral, Victoria had lost her 3 largest collectors. Charles Whitmore had been the first to go, citing a desire to focus on more diverse and authentic voices. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Association with Victoria Ashworth had become a liability. The art press, which had once courted her opinions and featured her insights, began treating her as a cautionary tale. Articles about bias in gallery systems invariably mentioned her rejection of Zara, usually alongside other examples of institutional discrimination that had cost the art world significant talent. Her name became synonymous with the kind of gatekeeping that progressive collectors and critics were actively working to dismantle. The financial ruin had followed artistic exile. Without collectors, without critical support, without the network of relationships that sustained high-end galleries, Ashworth Contemporary had withered like a plant deprived of light. The lease on the Madison Avenue space became unsustainable. Staff had to be let go. The inventory of carefully curated pieces was liquidated at prices that barely covered outstanding debts. Victoria had been forced to sell her personal collection, including the Basquiat that had anchored her office for 5 years. The irony wasn't lost on her. A black artist's work paying for the consequences of her rejection of another black artist. The symmetry felt like cosmic justice, poetic in its cruelty. Now she stood in the back of Sotheby's, wearing a suit she had purchased at a department store rather than having custom-made, watching the painting she had dismissed as that type of work prepare to make art history. The champagne she sipped tasted like failure, each bubble a reminder of all the celebrations she would never host again. The auctioneer, James Whitfield, commanded the podium with the authority of someone who had orchestrated countless cultural moments. His voice carried clearly through the packed auction room as he began the evening's proceedings, building momentum through earlier lots before reaching the main event. Each sale ratcheted up the tension, but everyone knew they were waiting for Lot 47. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitfield finally announced, his voice carrying the weight of significance, "we now present Lot 47, Zara Williams' Resilience in Blue, a work that represents not just artistic excellence but a cultural moment that has redefined how we discover and celebrate emerging talent." The painting was wheeled onto the easel under spotlights that made its blues and golds appear almost luminescent. A collective intake of breath swept through the auction room as viewers who had only seen photographs finally confronted the work's physical presence. The reproduction had been impressive. The original was transformative. "Bidding will open at $400,000, Whitfield announced, though everyone knew the estimate was conservative. The pre-sale buzz had been unprecedented, with phone bidders from around the world and several prominent collectors visibly present in the room. The first bid came immediately from a phone bidder, quickly followed by a paddle from the front row. The price climbed steadily through the estimate range: $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, each increment accompanied by a rustle of excitement that spread through the crowd like electricity. At $1 million, the pace slowed as only serious contenders remained in play. A tech billionaire known for supporting emerging artists raised his paddle with the casual gesture of someone for whom money was merely a tool for acquiring what mattered. A major museum representative spoke quietly into her phone, likely authorized to bid up to institutional limits. A collector from Hong Kong participated via video link, her image displayed on screens visible throughout the auction room. $1.5 million. Whitfield announced as the bidding crossed into territory reserved for established masters. The crowd buzzed with recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented. An artist who had been rejected 18 months ago now commanding prices. Typically reserved for blue-chip names, Zara sat motionless in her seat, but those who knew her could see the slight tremor in her hands, the careful control she maintained over her expression. This wasn't just financial validation, it was cultural vindication on the largest possible stage. Every bid was a refutation of the prejudice that had tried to silence her voice. At $2 million, the institutional bidders began dropping out, unable to compete with private collectors who weren't constrained by museum budgets. At $2.5 million, even some of the private collectors began hesitating, calculating whether the price had moved beyond rational market value into the realm of symbolic statement. But the bidding continued climbing. $3 million. 3.5 million. 4 million. Victoria felt each increment like a physical blow, her body registering the mounting price as punishment for her catastrophic error in judgment. She had turned away a painting now worth more than her gallery's entire annual revenue. Her rejection hadn't just cost her money. It had cost her relevance, reputation, everything she had spent 15 years building. 4.5 million, Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the excitement of someone witnessing history unfold. Only 2 bidders remained active, the tech billionaire in the front row and a phone bidder whose identity remained mysterious. The final moments stretched like hours, each pause between bids filled with anticipation that seemed to stop time itself. The phone bidder raised to 4.8 million. The tech billionaire countered with 4.9 million. The phone bidder's response took longer this time, consultation happening on the other end of the line while hundreds of people held their breath. $5 million, Whitfield announced as the phone bidder made their final offer. The tech billionaire hesitated, paddle halfway raised, calculating whether to continue pushing into uncharted territory. The pause stretched until it became clear that even he had reached his limit. The painting that Victoria Ashworth had rejected for not fitting her gallery's aesthetic direction was about to sell for $5 million. Selling at $5 million, Whitfield announced, raising his hammer. Fair warning at $5 million. The hammer fell with a sound that echoed through Sotheby's like a gunshot, followed by thunderous applause that seemed to shake the building's foundations. Resilience in Blue had shattered every expectation, every record for a living artist under 35, every assumption about what determined artistic value. Zara rose from her seat, tears streaming down her face as the art world's most prestigious institution validated not just her talent, but her worth as a human being. The standing ovation that followed felt like an apology from an industry that had almost lost one of its brightest lights to its own prejudice. In the back of the room, Victoria Ashworth stood frozen, champagne flute trembling in her hand, as she watched $5 million worth of art. Art she had dismissed, art she could have represented, art that might have saved her career, received the recognition it had always deserved. The revolution was complete, and it was painted in shades of resilience that no amount of prejudice could dim. 6 months after the auction that redefined art world expectations, 2 women sat in spaces that perfectly reflected the consequences of a single moment's choice. The symmetry was poetic in its completeness. Success and failure, recognition and obscurity. Futures gained and lost through the simple act of seeing or refusing to see. Zara Williams stood before a wall of windows in her new studio, a converted warehouse in Dumbo that offered panoramic views of Manhattan's glittering skyline. The space was 3 times larger than Victoria's former gallery, filled with canvases in various stages of completion, each one representing commissions from collectors who now competed for the privilege of owning her work. The morning light streaming through those windows caught the blues and golds of her latest painting, another exploration of resilience that would soon join museum collections around the world. The transformation in her life had been complete, yet authentic. Success hadn't changed her essential approach to art. She still mixed her own pigments, still drew inspiration from her grandmother's stories, still approached each canvas as a sacred conversation between past and future. But now the world listened with the respect that talent had always deserved. The warehouse buzzed with controlled creativity. 2 assistants helped prepare canvases and mix colors, but Zara insisted on maintaining direct connection to every brushstroke. A documentary crew worked quietly in one corner, filming a project about artists who had overcome institutional rejection to achieve recognition. 3 major museums had pieces on permanent display, and the Whitney was planning a solo exhibition for the following year. But perhaps the most satisfying element of her new reality was the letter that arrived each week from young artists around the world, painters and sculptors, photographers and installation artists who had been told their work wasn't suitable for serious consideration. They shared their own stories of rejection and resilience, finding inspiration in her journey from dismissed outsider to celebrated voice. Resilience in Blue itself now hung in the private collection of Patricia Morrison, the anonymous phone bidder whose $5 million purchase had made headlines around the world. Patricia, a tech entrepreneur who had built her fortune on algorithms but spent it supporting artistic voices that challenged conventional wisdom, had installed the painting in her San Francisco home, where it served as the centerpiece of monthly salons that brought together artists, critics, and collectors in conversations that were reshaping cultural conversations. The painting's influence extended far beyond its monetary value. Art schools now taught case studies about the importance of diverse perspectives in cultural gatekeeping. Gallery owners attended workshops on recognizing bias in their selection processes. Critics wrote extensively about the dangers of allowing personal prejudices to override professional judgment. Across the East River, Victoria Ashworth sat in a studio apartment in Queens, surrounded by the remnants of her former empire. The Rothko and Pollock had been sold to pay debts. The crystal chandeliers had been auctioned alongside her furniture when she could no longer afford the Madison Avenue rent. The reputation she had spent 15 years building had been dismantled in 18 months, brick by brick, relationship by relationship. The art world had a long memory for spectacular failures, and Victoria's rejection of Zara Williams had become the cautionary tale used to illustrate the costs of prejudice disguised as professional judgment. Former colleagues avoided her calls. Gallery openings that had once welcomed her attendance now found reasons to exclude her from invitation lists. The ecosystem that had once sustained her career had ejected her completely, treating her as a toxin that threatened their own credibility. She had attempted to rebuild, reaching out to smaller galleries, offering her expertise to emerging spaces that might benefit from her experience. But her name carried too much baggage, her story too much notoriety. The art world, for all its pretensions to forgiveness and second chances, showed little mercy to those who embodied its worst tendencies so publicly. The financial ruin had been swift and comprehensive. The gallery's closure had triggered a cascade of debt that consumed her personal assets. The apartment overlooking Central Park was gone, replaced by this modest space with windows that faced a parking lot. The custom suits had given way to off-the-rack clothing that hung differently on a body that had lost weight from stress and irregular meals. But perhaps the cruelest consequence was the intellectual isolation. Victoria had spent her career surrounded by conversations about art, culture, and meaning. Her days had been filled with discussions about technique and emotion, market trends, and cultural significance. Now she spent hours alone, her only connection to the art world through online articles that often mentioned her failure as context for broader discussions about institutional change. The irony wasn't lost on her that the painting she had rejected now served as the foundation for exactly the kind of meaningful cultural conversations she had once facilitated. Resilience in Blue had become a catalyst for discussions about representation, authenticity, and the responsibility that came with cultural gatekeeping. The work she had dismissed as unsuitable had proven more culturally significant than most of the pieces she had championed during her career. On this particular morning, Victoria sat with her laptop open to an article in Art Forum about Zara's upcoming Whitney exhibition. The photographs showed the artist in her studio, surrounded by paintings that demonstrated both technical evolution and thematic consistency. Each canvas built upon the foundation of Resilience in Blue, exploring themes of strength, identity, and triumph over adversity with increasing sophistication. The article's author, Dr. Patricia Hernandez from MoMA, had written, "Williams represents the kind of authentic voice that emerges when artistic institutions expand their definition of excellence beyond traditional boundaries. Her work demonstrates that the most powerful art often comes from perspectives that have been systematically excluded from mainstream recognition. The paragraph stung with particular force because Patricia had been Victoria's friend, a relationship that had ended when association with Victoria became professionally problematic. The loss of friendships had been almost as devastating as the financial consequences, leaving Victoria isolated in ways she was still learning to understand. A knock at the door interrupted her reading. The mailman handed her a certified letter that she opened with trembling fingers, expecting another legal notice related to her financial obligations. Instead, she found something unexpected. A letter from Zara Williams, handwritten on simple stationery that bore no resemblance to the expensive paper Victoria had once used for gallery correspondence. "Dear Mrs. Ashworth," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well. I've been thinking about our meeting 18 months ago, and I wanted to share some thoughts with you directly, rather than through the media attention that has surrounded both our stories." Victoria's hands shook as she continued reading. The letter was neither vindictive nor patronizing, but something far more unsettling. It was generous. Zara wrote about understanding the pressures that led to quick judgments, about recognizing the humanity in mistakes, about hoping that the entire experience might lead to positive changes in how the art world evaluated talent. "I don't write this to absolve anyone of responsibility," Zara continued, "but to acknowledge that systems of exclusion harm everyone, those who are excluded and those who do the excluding. Your rejection forced me to find a community that valued my work authentically, and for that, I'm grateful. I hope that our story helps prevent other artists from facing similar barriers." The letter concluded with an invitation that made Victoria's breath catch. "If you're interested, I would welcome a conversation about how we might work together to create more inclusive pathways for emerging artists. The art world needs people with experience and connections to help bridge the gap between traditional institutions and authentic voices that have been overlooked." Victoria set the letter down with hands that trembled, not from weakness, but from the unexpected possibility of redemption. The woman she had dismissed 18 months ago was offering something Victoria had thought impossible, a chance to transform her greatest failure into meaningful contribution. Outside her window, the Manhattan skyline glittered with afternoon light, the same light that illuminated Zara's studio and the painting that had changed both their lives forever. The future stretched before them both, shaped by choices yet to be made, conversations yet to be had, and the possibility that even the deepest mistakes might become foundations for something better. Resilience in Blue had taught the art world about the price of prejudice, but it had also demonstrated the power of authentic talent to overcome any barrier. In the end, genius had found its audience, justice had extracted its price, and two women who had collided in a moment of blindness now faced the possibility of moving forward with clearer vision. The revolution was complete, but the work of building something better was just beginning.